Most people assume the US dollar became the world's reserve currency simply because America was wealthy, powerful, or victorious after World War II. But that explanation is too convenient, too shallow. The real story is stranger. It begins not with triumph, but with chaos, a global system collapsing under its own weight, currencies in freefall, empires bankrupt, and a desperate search for a financial anchor strong enough to rebuild a shattered world. Yet here's the mystery. The United States didn't actually want the role at first, and the world didn't immediately trust the dollar either. In fact, a quiet fight between nations, economists, and even between competing visions of money itself determined whether the dollar would rise or fall. If one man had gotten his way, the global monetary system today wouldn't revolve around green pieces of paper from Washington. It would revolve around a new world currency, designed in the 1940s, but abandoned before it ever had a chance. This is the story of how World War II launched the dollar as the global reserve currency. From the smoky halls of Bretton Woods, to the oil politics that created the petrodollar, to the modern moment where the system built in the 1940s is cracking under pressures no one predicted. And it all starts with a world broken by war, desperate for stability and willing to gamble everything on a currency experiment. Before World War II, global trade revolved around gold and the British pound. Britain was the world's banker, the world's insurer, and the world's creditor. But by the 1930s, the financial engine of the British Empire was sputtering. 2 world wars drained its treasury. The Great Depression shattered confidence in its currency. And the British government began doing something unthinkable for a global financial leader, printing money and imposing strict capital controls. By the time German troops marched across Europe, the pound was losing its status, and the world was scrambling for alternatives. Currencies collapsed, nations hoarded gold, international trade seized up. Everyone needed stability, but no one could provide it. This is where the United States enters the picture, not as a savior, but as the only country left standing with the gold and industrial base to rebuild the global system. By 1944, the US held more than half of the world's gold reserves. Its economy was untouched by war. Its factories were running at full speed. And most importantly, every major nation owed money to Washington. Still, even with this enormous advantage, the dollar was not guaranteed to become the world's currency. Because while the US had resources, another figure had ideas. At the Bretton Woods conference in 1944, 2 men led a quiet intellectual battle for the future of global finance. On one side was Henry Dexter White, representing the United States. On the other was John Maynard Keynes, representing Britain. Keynes proposed a radical new system built around an international currency called the Bancor. Under his plan, no single country would control the world's money. Instead, nations would settle their balances through a global clearing union, which would punish both excessive debt and excessive savings. It was a design meant to prevent any country, especially the United States, from accumulating too much power. White had no interest in that. He knew the US was now the world's biggest creditor, and he saw an opportunity to cement American influence for decades. His proposal was simple. Peg every currency to the US dollar and peg the dollar to gold. That way the US controlled the anchor of the entire system. If other countries wanted stability, they'd have to hold dollars, and if they wanted dollars, they'd have to look to Washington. In the end, American power and gold reserves won. Keynes's Bancor died on the negotiating table, and the Bretton Woods system was born. The dollar was now as good as gold, and the world was officially tied to the American financial engine. But the victory came with a hidden weakness. The entire system depended on a paradox. For the world to have enough dollars to function, the United States had to send dollars abroad through trade deficits, foreign aid, or military spending. But the more dollars left the country, the less gold backing they had. Stability depended on trust, and trust depended on gold, and the gold supply was never going to grow fast enough to support an expanding global economy. This tension lay dormant for nearly 2 decades, but it grew quietly, year by year, as the US took on the role of global policeman, post-war builder, and financial backstop. By the 1960s, the world was drowning in US dollars, and central banks began asking an inconvenient question. If everyone tried to redeem their dollars for gold at once, could the US actually pay? The answer was no, and soon the world was calling America's bluff. France, under President Charles de Gaulle, became the loudest critic. He demanded gold for France's dollars and sent naval ships to pick it up. Other nations followed. Gold drained out of the US Treasury at an alarming rate. Suddenly, the system that made the dollar king was threatening to tear it apart. In 1971, President Richard Nixon faced an impossible choice. Defend the gold standard by slashing spending and tightening money, risking recession and political disaster, or break the system entirely by cutting the dollar's link to gold. Nixon chose the second option. In a televised announcement, he suspended dollar to gold convertibility, effectively ending the Bretton Woods system overnight. The world's financial foundation was now floating without a tether, and many feared the dollar would collapse. But here's the twist. Instead of collapsing, the dollar evolved. The United States engineered a new system that replaced gold with something far more powerful: oil. In the early 1970s, the US struck a deal with Saudi Arabia, the world's largest oil producer. The agreement was straightforward. The US would guarantee Saudi security, and in return, Saudi Arabia would price oil exclusively in US dollars. Other OPEC nations followed. Suddenly, every country on earth needed dollars, not gold, to buy energy. The petrodollar was born. This wasn't a currency system, it was a geopolitical machine. The dollar was now backed not by precious metal, but by the global necessity of fuel. Nations stockpiled dollars. Global trade relied on dollars. And US deficits no longer threatened collapse. Instead, they became the lifeblood of global liquidity. But once again, this stability carried hidden consequences. The petrodollar entrenched US financial dominance, but it also created imbalances even larger than those under Bretton Woods. The US could now run enormous deficits without immediate consequences. The financial sector exploded. Foreign governments recycled their export earnings into US Treasury bonds. American consumption soared, and as before, the world became dangerously dependent on a single currency. Every time the US raised interest rates, emerging markets cracked. Every global crisis became a dollar crisis. In the 1980s, Latin America's debt imploded. In the 1990s, Asia collapsed under currency pressure. In the 2000s, the housing bubble swelled under cheap global credit and burst spectacularly. And after 2008, the Federal Reserve became the emergency lender to the entire world, revealing just how tightly every financial system was tied to the dollar. Yet even with its flaws, no other currency rose to replace it. The euro struggled with structural conflicts between member nations. The yen stagnated under decades of deflation. China's renminbi remained restricted and politically constrained. Gold tried to make a comeback but lacked the flexibility a global economy demands. Attempts to create alternatives failed for the same reason Keynes's Bancor failed. The world couldn't agree on who should lead a new system, and nations weren't willing to give up sovereignty to make it happen. But now, pressures are building again. China and Russia are trading more outside the dollar. Middle Eastern nations are exploring energy deals in local currencies. Digital payment networks and decentralized assets have eroded the practical monopoly of dollar-based banks. And US debt has reached levels that would have been unthinkable during the Bretton Woods era. A growing share of global reserves is slowly shifting away from dollars. It's not a collapse, but it's a sign. The same pattern that ended previous systems, excess liquidity, global dependence, and structural imbalances is repeating. The mystery today mirrors the mystery of 1944. The world needs stability, but no one can agree on what should replace the aging system that built the modern world. As we look at the story as a whole, 3 clear takeaways emerge. First, Reserve currencies do not rise because a country demands power. They rise because the world demands stability. The dollar became dominant because the US was the only nation able to rebuild global order after 2 catastrophic wars. Second, every monetary system carries the seeds of its own destruction. Bretton Woods relied on gold it could never maintain. The petrodollar relies on geopolitical alliances and global liquidity that are increasingly strained. Stability always creates imbalances, and imbalances always force change. Third, the next global currency shift will not be sudden. It will be slow, uneven, and shaped by crisis. Just like Britain's decline and America's rise, the transition will only seem obvious in hindsight. The warning is simple: no reserve currency lasts forever. And the pressures building today look eerily similar to the pressures that ended every system before this one. Whether the dollar adapts again or gives way to something new depends on choices being made right now, often quietly, behind closed doors. If you want to understand the future of money, power, and global stability, don't just watch what politicians say. Watch what central banks accumulate. Watch what energy exporters demand. And watch where nations turn when crisis hits. Because the next transformation will begin the same way the last one did, with a world searching for an anchor, and a currency system struggling to hold it together. If you found this story insightful and want to understand more about how economic history shapes our world today, consider subscribing for future deep dives, and share this video with someone who still believes the dollar's dominance was inevitable. The truth, as always, is far more complicated.